Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, the changing religious landscape. Fewer Americans identify as Christians, and more say they do not have any religion, according to a new Pew Study of 35,000 people. In less than a decade, Christians have gone from representing almost 80% of the population to just more than 70%. While women still tend to be more religious than men, the percentage of women calling themselves Christians has dropped. Besides affecting both genders, this shift is occurring across adults of all ages, ethnic groups, and regions. On the other hand, membership in certain minority religions, such as Islam and Hinduism, has grown modestly. So, Debra Carnahan, why is it that women stick more with religion than men?
Well, I think women have a tendency to be more loyal, and they have to put up with men.
I think women have, they want to submit to a greater power, more likely than men. That's really my feeling about it.
I think that they're more faithful and hopeful than men are.
I think women might just be taking advantage of the positive things that religion has to offer.
Such as?
Such as a sense of community and family values.
And but my question really is, as having been a child of the 60s, is why is this taking so long? Because you guys are not old enough to remember, but in 1977, Time magazine ran a cover with the question, is God dead? There were so many people who were dropping out of religion, and then there was a resurgence. Now it's finally going back the other way. Why is this happening?
I think, and I was wondering this earlier as I'm reading through the articles, and I don't necessarily think that people are less religious. I think that they're more comfortable saying that they don't have a denomination and that they'd rather say that I'm spiritual. I think to a lot of people, especially millennials, that when they hear somebody being religious, it's like they go to church or some place of worship on a weekly basis, and a lot of people just don't.
What are churches going to have to do to reinvent themselves? And attract more people?
I don't think it's necessarily about reinventing yourself. Religion isn't a competition. It's not about numbers. I think, as you just mentioned with the Time magazine piece in the 70s, it's going to fluctuate. It's going to go up and down, and I think it's going to come back. I don't think Christianity is in a free fall at all.
Is it a matter of education? The more educated people, I mean, look at Europe. Europe is ahead of us on this curve, and the reason clearly is not just a much more educated society, but more highly educated women. I've always looked at Italy and thought, why, Italians, I mean, they go to church, but they don't pay attention to Catholicism at all. Every man has a mistress. Every woman has a PhD in her own career, and the reason is that high level of educated people in the population.
Well, surely the liberal ideas that came from Europe have come over here and come to our major institutions and trickled down to the masses. So these liberal ideas have led people to think that they don't have to be a part of something rigid anymore, that they can have freedom to sort of explore what else is out there, especially in this information age where at the smartphone we can, with the click of a button, find out about something new. You told me what yoga is and I don't know what that word is. I'm looking it up and figuring out where its roots are in, and it's Hinduism. And so I agree with you, Danielle. Spirituality is becoming more mainstream now. People are more likely to, the Pew Research study tells us.
What does somebody mean when he or she says that she's spiritual?
I think
I mean, I would say
could
that
have 100 meanings, right?
It could, but I think that that's the beauty of it. It just means that I believe that there is something out there that is greater than myself, right? And that I'm connected to something that is bigger than just me here in this moment. But I don't think that they feel the need to necessarily define it or call it something.
Or even if they don't practice, so they might align themselves with Christian values and beliefs and everything that it stands for, but they just might not go to church every Sunday. So they're like, am I practicing my faith? Do I define myself as this now? And that's where I think some people are like, how do I define it myself?
Okay, well, I think we have to look at some of the numbers, though, too. I know you're addressing being soulful, being spiritual, but it seems to me in looking at that the numbers are kind of following what's happening in our politics in this country. You have the evangelicals.
Or the other way around.
Yes. No, I didn't believe that. But as far as the evangelicals, which are more strongly one way and more rigid, that group is growing. And the more moderates and in the middle, they're the ones that are kind of going, I don't necessarily affiliate with a certain church. You've got that with party identification, too, with, the growing independents. that party and maybe the Libertarian Party. Those are growing. So I think people do feel more of a freedom when you're more in the middle, not to classify yourself in one way. And the other thing I'd like to point out is if you looked, it said in the African American churches, pretty much stayed stable, which still have their churches and their church leaders a huge part of the community and messaging of community. We have an incredible rise in the use of social media. What role does that play with people connecting to each other, sharing ideas,
well,
getting that sense of community?
Are churches using social media? Or should they start using it more?
I think they should more increasingly, because we've already seen the brand of new brand of churches, which are more, the worship is different, the service is different. But looking back at the numbers, you bring up an excellent point. It's important to note that in the United States, we still have more churchgoers on Sunday than per capita than any other nation. And I think that's really important. That's something that's not changing.
And that's why I don't think that we're in a free fall, like was said. I don't think that we're in a free fall. I think that the way that we, worship is just changing. And I do think that churches need to evolve in that sense, whether they do it on social media, if they do a Twitter town hall church meeting,
But
more
Amber,
people.
I want to ask you, because Debra makes a good point about evangelism growing. And if you look at the data show evangelism is really growing among immigrants, particularly Central and South American immigrants, not so much African immigrants or not so much European immigrants. On the other hand, the Republican Party is pretty wedded to evangelical Christians. So if the number, its core, which is not Central and South American immigrants, but white Americans, what does that say about the future of the party and its relationship with evangelical Christians?
Well, I wouldn't say that the Republican Party is tied to evangelical Christians. I think there's just probably a couple social conservative issues that the Republican Party and those type of Christians might agree on, but I don't think it's like a hard line necessarily.
But really? I mean, because every Republican I know, and lots of former moderate Republicans who've fallen away from the party, just bemoan the fact that the evangelical Christians now they certainly control the primaries, they control the presidential
I don't like
selection
necessarily
process, and they're
a group
really
of
running
people
the party
into one specific category, just like that. I think that, there's Republicans who aren't evangelical Christians. There's evangelical Christians who aren't Republicans. That's why I said they might agree on specific issues, but I'm not going to group them all into one specific party.
No, I mean, you've had Republican political leaders, high ups, majority, leaders in the Senate and in the House talking about the party being taken over by the religious right. And if we don't get a hold of that, they will be running our party. And I think you see that in your presidential primaries, and you're seeing it right now.
Well, look at all the candidates, who could be the most conservative Christian among them. That's the one who's going to win the most votes.
Well, already we're talking about that. Who's got the most likely chance? And we're already writing off people like Ted Cruz. And I'm not saying that because I'm a moderate Republican. I'm saying that because it's the truth. We as a party are going through something right now that is very different in time, and it's almost cathartic. We're figuring out where we're going and how to really court people under the big banner, big tent Republicanism.
Yeah, but if, as the Pew data show, the number of white evangelical Christians is dropping, and the Christian evangelicals of color are voting mainly Democratic, what does the party need to, if it stays with that white conservative base, which is in decline numbers-wise or percentage-wise of the U.S. population, what does it mean for its future?
It means the pure decline of the party, and we know that as a party because of the 2012 Growth and Opportunity Project, the autopsy we did of 2012's election, because we realized we cannot pander to one base. We've got to figure out how to bring in new races, new ages, and essentially people of different faiths. I mean, this is America, and I know the Republican Party is waking up to it. It's going to take a while for the public to see it.
No, I agree. I think that what Republicans have seen is that moving that far to the right is not going to change the landscape for them. They're not going to win the White House that way. They may win in certain, in certain pockets of the countries and occupy the Senate and what have you, but they're not going to win the White House. And so to understand that is they have to do a review, which is what they did, and say, how do we reach more people? And we know that the demographics are shifting in this country, and we're becoming browner and more black and brown people are going to be the majority. And so what are the policies that they have to create that are going to bring more people to the table?
We're working on those. They're in the pipeline right now, and I think the
What
American public will see them.
changing?
We're figuring out how to court that Hispanic vote, which is very important. Everybody knows. Let's be honest. I mean, the country has a changing face, and
wouldn't you say that Cruz and Marco Rubio being in the presidential race?
No, having those names, right? There's something about it, having those names in the race. But let's not forget, they're of a different sort of background, and the experience is different, so they can't quite connect. But it's helpful. I think we're talking about policy changes here more so than messaging.
I'd love your thoughts on all this.
I think when it comes down to parties, especially on the Republican side, too often we have one-issue voters, and as soon as their candidate is out of the primary, they stay home. And I think that is where a huge problem within the Republican Party lies, is people not coming to the polls and voting for their candidate because their previous candidate in a primary election isn't who is there on election day.
You're right.
Well, I kind of disagree with that, because when you look at the presidential general election, it's usually pretty close, and the numbers are pretty even, and it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller all the time. And just to say this, what my opinion is the Republican Party is going to have to do in the future, and they already are doing it, voter suppression, stricter voter ID laws, and redistricting and getting control of the state houses.
All right. Woo. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnier Bay or at To The Contrary. Behind the headlines. Food security is a term with many possible definitions. For our purposes, we define it as the availability, safety, sustainability, adequacy, and affordable cost of food. Issues we don't have to worry about here in the U.S., right? Not exactly. We begin a two-part series on food security. We will look at how a growing diverse population, changing tastes, and our farming methods are straining our food system and putting us at risk for food insecurity. Americans love to eat. At home, in restaurants, even on the streets. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Americans spend between 9 and 11% of their income on food. And most don't worry that they will ever go without something to eat.
Everything is just so made available. If I am hungry, I just can go to the 24-hour grocery store.
Although most Americans take their food for granted, the food system in the U.S. is complicated. The U.S. has the most high-tech, regulated, and reliable network of food production in the world. But despite our abundant supply, we are not the largest food producer in the world. China and India produce more food, mainly because they grow rice, while the U.S. produces more protein, such as beef, pork, and poultry. The U.S. has also been a net exporter of food since 1960, but that doesn't mean the U.S. is food self-sufficient. In fact, we are becoming less able to supply our own food and becoming more reliant on imports. The reasons? A growing ethnically diverse population, demanding more varieties of food of all kinds. Americans want better quality, more convenience, and an increasingly wider selection of seasonal food products all year round.
We have the impact of immigration, that this is a much more diverse society, and we have the impact of population growth. For example, over the last 35 years, the population of California has actually more than doubled, so that creates a lot more population density, a lot more people living close together.
We bring in about 5 times as many immigrants annually as we did in the mid-1960s. And because of that, we're on track to add about 200 million people to our population between now and 2100. So that has pretty obvious implications for food security, water use in the arid West, and a whole host of environmental issues. If we want to stabilize our population, we will have to limit immigration.
So a drought or a coup in a supplier country could temporarily interrupt supply of a particular type or leave us without access to it for a long time. Consider the California drought. Some East Coast grocery stores posted notices that product prices, in this case pistachios, are heading skyward. That because they come from California. Experts add the complete effects of the California drought on food availability aren't yet known, but one major problem is California is using, possibly exhausting, its groundwater resources.
We use that groundwater not as our saving accounts, but as our checking account before the drought. And the problem is that now we have way less groundwater than we should have. That is a finite resource. How much water we have in our ground, that's the million-dollar question.
Without groundwater, farmland can become unusable. All of these changes in our diet have altered the American food basket and are creating cracks in U.S. food security.
As long as consumers demand a diversity of foods, we're going to have to import because we simply don't have the climate to grow everything here. And we're not going to be the lowest cost producer of things also. So imports in a global food market are the future.
The population growth increases the total demand for food. There are more people to feed. So one impact is that it may actually increase food prices because we haven't necessarily increased the productive land enough for that, so we may have to import, or otherwise certain things become more expensive.
The growth and diversity in population has been increasing our imports over the last 16 years. According to the Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, U.S. food imports grew from $41 billion in 1999 to almost $110 billion in 2013. Much of the growth has been in fruits and vegetables, processed foods, and seafood. Although there are some places around the country that have fresh and local seafood, an estimated 90% of the seafood Americans eat is imported. About half of that comes from aquaculture or farm-raised fish. In 2013, China exported some $2.5 billion worth of tilapia, cod, shrimp, and salmon to the U.S. Thailand, China, and Vietnam supply most of the shrimp we eat, and tilapia, a name for many types of fish and one that is easily farm-raised, comes from China, Indonesia, Ecuador, and Honduras. According to experts, aside from the country of origin, U.S. consumers often have no way of knowing how imported fish was caught or produced.
We don't truly know how much food we import. We know the dollar value of what comes across the border as it's claimed. We don't actually know what the foreign content is of the material that we eat every day.
Regulating imports into the country is the job of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Since the agency only physically inspects 1% to 2% of imports, it relies mainly on data submitted from importers and on past performance of violators. Last year, there were more than 17,000 imported food shipments rejected by the FDA. Some of the reasons, according to FDA labeling, the food was putrid, it was missing information, or contained salmonella. But critics of the agency say the refusal rates have stayed the same while imports have grown, and the FDA is not equipped to handle growing imports.
The expectation is everything is safe, and FDA is doing everything appropriate to ensure that safety. But the 180 rule will say, wrong. That's not what's happening. And it's by dysfunction and not having the appropriate setup or systems in place culturally or physically.
Nielsen says the agency has a lot of information about imports, but not the right kind of information.
Keep in mind the existing system that's been in place both with Customs and FDA is very similar to the information the consumer gets when they purchase something at the grocery store. You get a receipt afterwards, you actually had a chance to look at the product, and you got a receipt that identifies it and what the cost is. That's basically invoice information. And that's also what's available largely to the agency at the border.
Experts say not knowing everything about where or how imported food is produced leaves vulnerabilities in the food security system.
What's risky is not knowing the supply chain that's sourcing the food. I am more comfortable with a good company in a bad country than a mediocre company in a good country.
Not knowing how food is produced can and has led to illness and death. The Centers for Disease Control reports that 1 in 6 Americans, or 48 million people, get sick from foodborne diseases each year. 3,000 die. The CDC also reports outbreaks linked to imported foods rose from 2005 to 2010. Over those 5 years, imported foods caused 39 outbreaks and 2,348 reported illnesses. The most common culprits? Fish and spices, particularly peppers. Fish were behind 17 of the outbreaks. Spices were the source of 6 outbreaks, 5 of which were traced to fresh or dried peppers. Almost half of the foods causing the outbreaks, 45%, came from Asia. And the CDC warns the statistics are most likely underestimated because many outbreaks are never discovered and because not all illnesses are reported. Foodborne illness also costs the economy more than $14.6 billion annually, that according to a study conducted by the Economic Research Service and the University of Florida. Stefan Latour is one of the 1 in 6 statistics. He became violently ill after eating pepperoni pizza.
I drove to the emergency room entrance, took the keys out my truck, went and gave the lady my keys, and I said, I'm parked out front. I'm sick. I thought I was dying. I was literally that sick. I'd never been that sick before, ever.
But Stefan wasn't alone. After he was admitted to the hospital, he was told there were others who were also sick from the pepperoni.
She said, you're the 11th person that's coming here today that had a pepperoni pizza. And they were from all different places, but apparently they were all using the same distributor and they had a bad batch of pepperoni pizza.
After overnighting in the hospital, going on an IV for fluids, and getting his stomach pumped, he was released.
I had never been that sick, never had food poisoning before, and never wanted again.
Tainted imports are also sometimes killing our pets. Since 2007, the FDA has been receiving complaints and been investigating pet treats from China. More than 1,000 dogs and cats have died, and an estimated 5,000 have become ill from eating those treats. It has also been reported that a few children have become ill from eating the pet treats. The FDA hasn't barred entry for the defective treats, but it warns owners they should be aware that manufacturers do not need to list the country of origin for each ingredient used in their products, and thus may still contain ingredients sourced from China or other countries that export to the U.S.
The one thing I am concerned about is dog treats. I have 4 dogs, and dog food and dog treats is one thing that I'm especially concerned about, whether it's coming from the United States or from China.
As the population grows and the U.S. depends on even more imports, the risk for illness and for food insecurity goes up. So, Amber, what do you think is the biggest risk to our food security?
I think because of our growing population and the demands that it puts on our food supply system, the biggest problem is the lack of accountability within that supply chain, especially when it comes to import. If we don't have a way to track where it's coming from and how it's processed and delivered to the U.S., that poses some very serious risks.
I think water. The supply of water, the lack of it, selling our water, that is our #1 security risk to our food system in this country.
So how do you fix that? That's an awfully big...
It is an awfully big thing, but we have to address it. We have to quit allowing there to be golf courses in Arizona and using water supply to make that green. I mean, there are things that we have to get realistic about. We can't have unlimited water and just pay $50 a month or $70 for your water.
The demand for a more diverse food supply in this country is certainly a pressure. With immigration, we see that need rise, and I think, Americans are really used to affordable and abundant food, and as we're going to see many changes in our population, the face of it, we're going to need to address these things.
I think that we need to have a really comprehensive conversation about climate change and why California has been in a drought for the past year and why there are
4 years,
four years, why we're having a drought and how that's affecting the rest of us. I think that unless we hold our policymakers accountable for creating comprehensive climate change policy, then we're not going to address this because we're going to have to go elsewhere to go get our food.
And that's a great thought to end on. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.
Yeah, I think so too.